Hi everyone, welcome to the Grand Duke Dmitri YouTube series. Today I am Dimitri's because it's Sunday and that's the day when I use my Christian name. I have an icon here of the Russian imperial family. Very nice, a friend gave that to me. I like that they're wearing the old Muscovite style clothing, and they are venerated in the Russian Orthodox Church as passion bearers, not as saints, but as something similar, as passion bearers. So people who were killed for their faith. I don't know if that's exactly correct, but they certainly met an end that they did not deserve. Okay, so we are in 1935 today. And our recap. In the last 1915 diary entry, we had Dmitri getting some gifts from Brasova. Crosses, oddly enough. I just ordered an antique cross pendant, I guess you'd say, for a necklace from Ukraine. And it's an Old Believer's cross made out of bronze. Old Believers tend, if I understand correctly, I was instructed once by a couple of Old Believers who came into the Greek Orthodox bookstore that I managed, and they told me I should not be selling silver crosses because silver, of course, was what Judas had betrayed Christ for, the 30 pieces of silver, I think, and that gold was too proud. And so yeah, bronze, I guess, and wood and other things are all right. Not that I'm an Old Believer, but I'm excited to get this cross. It's 18th century, I think. So Dmitri got two crosses from Brasova. I didn't know he collected such things, but anyway, there was that, and he also wrote a letter to the ballerina Balashova. And in 1935, we had the first part of the speech that he made at a Young Russia rally on the 12th of June, 1935, to mark the occasion of the creation of the head of the, or I'm sorry, he was made the head of this newly created sports organization for young people so that they would have an outlet in sports. Young members of the Russian emigre community who had been born outside of Russia, who'd never known what was, at least as far as their parents were concerned, this was their children's a true homeland, but their children had never set foot there. Okay, and we're going to be completing that speech. So our cast for today, well, no, the recap for 1935, Dmitri was praising the Soviet accomplishment of building the world's largest airplane and scolding those people who took a certain amount of glee in the fact that that airplane quickly crashed, and telling them, look, we shouldn't be happy when something happens that undermines Russia's standing in the world. Okay, and our cast today is a person whom Dmitri refers to as the One. Sounds very religious, doesn't it? We'll talk about that. I think you already know who he is, probably from the thumbnail, but this is a very interesting presentation of him. Okay, so here we go. And I'll start with the last line from where I broke off last time, which is Dmitri saying, I am sometimes forced to hear unbelievable things. And here we go. Sometimes you meet people who hope that the power of the Russian army is exaggerated, or even that it's so weak that it wouldn't be able to resist an onslaught from the east or the west. Such thoughts are incomprehensible to me, because the defeat of the army wouldn't in any way be a step toward the revival of our fatherland, but a terrible blow to Russia and Russian dignity. just making a note with fatherland. Okay, the new badges that will be given to you today have a deep symbolic meaning. The Russian orb under the shadow of the cross. We are not only Russians, we are Orthodox, and we think of the future Russia as a Russia closely linked to and led by our Russian Orthodox Church. The orb symbolizes our unity. One of the main virtues of the movement is the overcoming of all class differences between those who join our ranks, no matter what background our members come to us from. They are all equal in their hopes, their patriotism, and their love for the living Russia. We are all monarchists. We are deeply committed to the high monarchical principle and are closely connected to the One who, from his home in Saint-Briac, sets us an example of high sacrifice and love for the motherland. Aha, very interesting, very interesting. So the Russian army, so a lot of the emigres, especially those on the far right, were indeed hoping that the Soviet Union, that every institution, including the army within the Soviet Union, would fail. And, it's a little different from what the situation is nowadays. I'm sure there are Russian immigrants and emigres nowadays who find it difficult to, they don't want to see Russia, the Russian army fail or be defeated. But on the other hand, they also don't want it to succeed, and so that's a real quandary, isn't it? I'm glad I'm not, at the moment at least, in that situation. But it was a different situation because by 1935 things weren't so dire, but there was already with Hitler installed in Germany, there was already this sense that that Russia could be invaded, and so. Dmitri and like-minded Russians were not hoping that would happen. They didn't want a foreign power to come in, even if it meant the end of the Soviet power. Okay, so it is interesting that he uses two different terms here. He uses the word fatherland, as he did earlier in the speech, but at the end he also uses the word motherland. The word fatherland is more about force and power and prestige. Of course, the word motherland is more sentimental. It made me stop and think, what forms of that do different countries use? And I don't think I've ever heard either in the U.S., and probably because even though the people who came from other parts of the world are certainly in the majority now, so that people like me were born here, but we still don't call it our motherland or our fatherland. And I suppose that's just because it is an immigrant country, and it's supposed to be an immigrant country. So if you hear someone, say an Irish person, talk about the motherland, then they're talking about Ireland, even several generations on. So mostly in Russian literature and that sort of thing, I find, correct me if I'm wrong, but I find that fatherland is very rare. So that may be a kind of adaptation to the fact that now they want this sort of projection of force. And in his diaries and other things, Dmitri always uses the word motherland, Rodina. So at the end of the speech, as he concludes it, he goes back to that more sort of sentimental term. So this idea of Russian dignity, well, you can go back to Peter the Great, and you can see that for him, Russian dignity was completely tied into the idea of Russia's standing in the world in the eyes of other countries, and the idea of Russia becoming an international, a geopolitical great power. And, Dmitri, is that what he means? I think it is an outward-looking use of that term, Russian dignity, and it's, been an issue for Russians. It was an issue for Russians for centuries. this idea that in Western Europe they were very much looked down on as barbarians. And so there is this collective sort of self-esteem issue, that whether you were a Grand Duke or, a more humble person, there's a little bit of touchiness. There's a little bit of a chip on the shoulder about Russian dignity. I don't know how much people think of it in those terms in other country. I haven't really heard that in relation to the U.S. American dignity, it's at a pretty low ebb at the moment. I kind of wish people would more think of it in those terms. But anyway, then this idea of orthodoxy. I mean, that Dmitri was very interested in esoteric religions. He had this, how did he refer to him? Hindu doctor, he says, that he conferred with before he went to Schatzalp, so not too long after this. It would have been either shortly before this or shortly after this. Must have been slightly before, because he went to... No, sorry, this is 1935. I was thinking 1939. So it would come later. Anyway, yeah, he was into New Thought and esoteric religion, but still at the core, he would always consider himself Orthodox. I go to a Greek Orthodox church, and I know that Greek people who are Orthodox at least, tend to think as them being, almost the same thing. If you're Greek Orthodox, you're Greek. If you're Greek, you're Greek Orthodox. And so same with the Russian Orthodox Church. So there is just no way, I don't know about specific beliefs, for instance. Did he believe in, reincarnation or anything like that? I don't know. But if he did, he still absolutely considers himself to be Orthodox, whether priests would appreciate that or not. Okay, so the next thing he talks about is class differences. And again, that's very interesting, and that's something that he's been consistent on, going back to when he was first really taking a political role in 1921 and talking about, these issues. So this is one of the things that needs to be carried over. If we manage to get rid of the Bolshevik and then the Soviet government, we can't go back to this system of, this class hierarchy. And what are the three things then that erase these class differences in the Russian identity specifically? Well, they are, he says, hopes, patriotism, and love for Russia. And so basically just patriotism across the board, and understanding that we're not giving up on Russia, and that this is sufficient to erase class differences. And I wonder if he lived that principle. I just don't know. In the circles he moved in, he probably didn't meet a lot of people from humbler backgrounds. But on the other hand, as long as he was involved in Young Russia, I'm sure he was meeting some young people who fit that description. And I don't think Dmitri was a snob, really. He kind of met people where they were at. There was one incident in 1918 where he was driving from Tehran to Baghdad with a British sergeant, just the two of them driving through the desert. And, he really enjoyed the guy's company. And that sort of thing, he wasn't going to have his nose in the air in situations like that. And the guy really liked him too. Okay, so living Russia. It's not just that their hopes, their patriotism, and their love are directed to Russia, but they're directed to the living Russia. And I personally think that's a very good thing for him to point out in the speech, that once again, very consistently across the years, ever since the aftermath of the revolution, he's been talking about how Russia needs to be looking toward the future. And in fact, the title of this speech is Toward a Young Russia. So the young Russians called these sort of people who were looking back always to the past and wanting to bring back the past as buffaloes or bison, because, referring to the extinction of the buffaloes. So that was their nickname for them. And Dmitri definitely was not a buffalo in his mindset. Finally, we get to one of the most interesting things at the end of this speech. How did Dmitri feel talking about this? Because, Dmitri's son just adamantly assured me that he just remembered his father, what his father said about Kirill as being really harsh things, that he really didn't like the guy. Okay, but here he is saying that we are deeply committed to the high monarchical principle and are closely connected to the One with a capital O, who from his home in Sandriak sets us an example of high sacrifice and love for the motherland. So here's this sort of messianic strain that's very very big part of sort of Russian thought. Definitely in the 19th century, probably you could also say in the 20th century. If Lenin fits that bill, I don't know. Dmitri had sometimes some sorts of messianic ideas about himself. Nicholas II certainly had a kind of messianic idea of the role he was given from God. And so now Kirill has taken this on, clearly. He's the one. He's the high sacrifice. He's Christ, essentially, in this scenario. He's Russia's Christ and Russia's Messiah. Sandriak being, of course, where he lived. He would live another He would die in 38. His wife would die in 36. They were both alive at this time. And boy, that's just really putting it in the most grandiose terms. And as I say, I really wonder, if Dmitri was biting his tongue or, who knows? He was Kirill's representative. Okay, so what do we have next time? Well, we go on to another topic, not whether Russia is living or dead, not Russian dignity, but the Russian soul. That's the big one, isn't it? That's in 1935, on the 14th of June rather than the 12th of June, 1935. In 1915, we have Dmitri. He would sometimes get into these very sort of wistful and contemplative moods where he's thinking about the future. What is going to happen? What's my life going to be like? What's the world going to be like? And that's more that never surprised me after the revolution, when he had no idea what the future was going to be like, but he was already doing it in 1915. And when is this damned war going to be over, sort of a thing, and what's our life going to be like? Okay, and he will also be taking this very interesting walk in the middle of the night in the snow. So I hope to see you again for both of those. Thanks for watching. Bye.